Hello and welcome back to the KCC channel. I'm Rob and I hope you are having a wonderful day today. Today we're jumping into a compilation of malicious compliance stories. This story comes to us from Appropriate Rip 9996. Assign the incompetent guy the task of making a business plan. Let's jump right in. I was told to post this here. Perhaps the person will recognize the story and see that I did as I was told. Many years ago, I was tasked with making a business plan for a woman-owned and operated business in a rural, low-income area where English is not spoken. There was a big grant from outside the country that made this project happen, and a country-based NGO, non-governmental organization, that managed the grant. The business had been dependent on the grant for years. The idea was to use the business plan to make the business independent and self-sufficient, so the grant could then go to a new rural area and begin again with a new business employing new women. I worked for the NGO administering the grant. I explained that I was not the best person to do a business plan because 1. I don't speak the language. 2. I never owned a business. 3. I don't have a business degree, nor have I ever taken a business course. 4. I don't have any experience or knowledge of what a business plan is. They insisted that none of the above disqualify me from making a business plan for this project. I should also say that I didn't have the internet to help me. The internet was 3 long bus rides away and would require a stay overnight at a hotel where I would use an expensive internet cafe that had viruses and keystroke loggers and charged by the minute. The 90s. This would all be on my dollar, so I didn't do it. I didn't have a car. The town had one phone line with no outlet. It was just a piece of copper wired to an old phone guarded by the guy who also reads all your mail. Phone calls were expensive. I imagined that a business plan assessed the efficiency of use of assets and also tracked and categorized all income and expenses. This was the basis for my plan. I started asking questions and I was asked for the finished plan. I explained that it was taking a bit longer than expected because of language barriers, but a description of the grant would help. I got a pile of unorganized papers. Some of the papers were in English. I found out that the grant purchased a truck to collect and deliver raw materials and finished products. There were no vehicles in the village. A bus came through, but no one owned a vehicle. No one had ever seen a truck. Also, it said that the grant purchased the building of the business. However, in talking with the locals many times using redundant terms and phrases to ensure understanding, I learned that the building was rented. I met the owner who had no affiliation with the business. They just sat collecting rent money each month. This was surprising because I had been told by the NGO that the building was owned by the business. I imagined that somewhere there was someone in the capital city sitting on a fat stack of cash, enough to buy a house, and driving a free truck to their summer house with a pool. It occurred to me that they picked me to make the business plan because I wouldn't do a thorough job and find these discrepancies. They also would not expect me to report their embezzlement to the organization doing the embezzlement. However, that is what I did. I told the NGO that self-sufficiency would always be a long way off if the business was hampered by rent that was more than collective monthly wages. I mentioned that selling the truck might help, as it appeared to not be used for the purposes listed in the grant. I sent my business plan in. The country that provided the grant visited. The missing truck mysteriously showed up. The ambassador person was surprised to see me in this rural village. I looked like I was not from there. And they spoke some English. They asked if I lived there. I said yes. They asked if I knew what was going on. I said yes. The NGO person from the capital was there and overheard. They knew what I knew and also knew that the ambassador would not love to hear about embezzlement, even though it is common in low-income areas with NGOs. That is when I lost my job. I never told the ambassador that money was misappropriated. I believe that to do so would result in some consequences, trumped up charges for embarrassing country officials, where I would be at a tremendous disadvantage in a country that the ambassador would not be able to help me with. Also, the fact that the conversation ended there tells me that the ambassador was not at their first rodeo and knew that it was 90% performance. I think he genuinely wanted to see some good come to the village, even if it didn't meet the level specified in the grant. I think the question about, do you know what is going on, was merely to see if I saw what he was seeing. I feel proud of what I did because I probably could have turned in a crap business plan and they would have praised me for it, but I did exactly what I was told, even though it was difficult and challenging. And for that, my services were no longer needed. I guess I'm missing the part where they face consequences of my compliance, but it felt good to let them know they were not so sly as they thought. And I got out of a situation where I could have been partly blamed for corruption had I stayed. This is an incredibly powerful story of integrity, courage, and commitment to doing the right thing, even in the face of potential personal consequences. Your commitment to truth and justice, despite the many challenges you faced, is commendable. You took on a task for which you felt unqualified, yet you approached it with such dedication and thoroughness that you uncovered deep-seated corruption. Your story highlights the importance of transparency and accountability in all operations, but particularly in the field of development, where funds are meant to alleviate poverty and promote socioeconomic growth. It's unfortunate that corruption remains an issue in many places, hindering progress and misdirecting funds that could be used to help those who truly need it. It's also a reminder that the right thing to do is not always the easiest path to take. You lost your job, but you maintained your integrity, and that is something no one can take away from you. Despite not having the typical qualifications to create a business plan, your diligent work led to the exposure of corruption. This illustrates that an open mind, a commitment to learning, and a desire to do what is right can be just as valuable as a formal education or experience. I applaud your strength and integrity. Your story is a sobering reminder of the realities many face, but it also offers hope. Your actions did make a difference, even if the immediate outcome wasn't as just as it should have been. This is a thought-provoking and inspiring tale that will undoubtedly resonate with many readers. This story comes to us from Faulty Carbon. Keep rinsing the rice until the water runs clear? Got it. Let's jump right in. Years ago, I was a cook at a well-known fast casual restaurant known for their large burritos and charging extra for guac. I worked hard because the place was very understaffed, given the number of customers that came in. Management was understanding when we had to cut corners to make sure people did not wait for food. One of the rules we had to follow before cooking the rice was to rinse the raw rice 3 times until the water runs clear. Vague, I know. How clear is clear? What if, after 3 rinses, the water is not clear, 3 times and runs clear, or 3 times or runs clear? Who knows? I did not ask. Most of the time, we would give the rice 1 or 2 rinses before throwing it in the cooker. Never had any problems with customers complaining about it, and we never ran out of rice. Since there were never any problems, management did not care. Everyone was happy. That is until one day, Miss Manager decides it is time to enforce every single rule exactly, not sure why. To get to the position she was in, she knew how to do all the individual tasks in the kitchen, so she knew the rules. However, she did not know how to conduct the symphony of the dozens of simultaneous tasks at the speed and accuracy required to keep customers moving, and to never burn anything. I did. She did not know which corners were okay to cut, and which ones were not. I did. I was getting ready for the busy shift, but the kitchen was not in busy mode yet. I am rinsing rice and Miss Manager approaches me. Make sure to rinse the rice until the water runs clear. I look at her and respond, I always do. She knew I was lying, but she knew why. She knew that it would take longer to make the rice, but I was the only one who could make sure that the rice never runs out. Her life would be heck if we ran out of rice. She had a chance to let it go. She did not, though. Mr. Cook, I know you don't follow that rule. Keep rinsing the rice until the water runs clear, and before you put this rice on the cooker, come find me and show me that it runs clear. I looked at her with a straight face and replied, keep rinsing the rice until the water runs clear. Got it. I begin, fill the pot of rice with water, agitate the rice, pull out the perforated part of the pot, and dump out all the cloudy water. After 3 times, the water still resembles water skim milk. I look up, she is watching me. She asks, "Does that water look clear to you?" It was rhetorical. I see how it is. I start rinsing again. Satisfied, she walks away. I continue repeating the process. A while goes by, and yes, I am counting the number of times. The long grains of rice are breaking apart, and the entire pot is turning into a strange, mushy mixture of white rice. Given the time I'm taking on this dumb task, everything else that needs to get started in the kitchen is falling behind. Finally, Miss Manager appears in the kitchen again. "You're still rinsing rice?" The timing was perfect. I dump out the water in front of her and ask, "Does the water look clear to you?" As I dump out the precursor to slightly watered down horchata, she softly says, "No." I step away from the sink. "How many times do you think I've rinsed this rice?" I ask. 7, she answers. "No, try 37. I wasn't joking. I have rinsed this rice 37 times, and the water is not running clear to your satisfaction. Should I continue?" She looks at the rice, knows it is unusable, and that she has lost the fight. On one hand, she cannot tell me to keep going because the ground up rice was only a few rinses and a cook away from becoming grits. On the other hand, she cannot tell me to stop rinsing because then she would be in violation of the sacred rice rinsing commandment. Additionally, she cannot fire me, otherwise the store could not open. She scheduled me to work the entire day, and she sure knows that she could not do what I do in the kitchen. "Fine," she relents. "Go back in there and make sure we're ready when it's time to open." I laughed to myself as I went back to work. I win. The joys of working in a fast casual restaurant, the epic battle between the rice and Miss Manager with the fate of the entire kitchen hanging in the balance. It's like a high-stakes drama unfolding in the sink. I can imagine the frustration of trying to decipher the vague instructions of rinse the rice until the water runs clear. Seriously, how clear is clear? Are we talking crystal clear like a mountain spring, or just clear enough to avoid the occasional rice residue floating around? The mysteries of culinary protocol, my friends. But fear not, our hero Mr. Cook emerges as the champion of rice rinsing. Armed with perseverance and a healthy dose of stubbornness, he takes on the arduous task of rinsing that rice like a pro. 37 times, people. That's dedication right there. I hope he had a little rice rinse counter because, at that point, he was practically an Olympic athlete in the sport of rice rinsing. And let's not forget Miss Manager, the enforcer of rules and keeper of the sacred rice rinsing commandment. She may have underestimated our hero's determination and ability to turn a simple task into a comedic showdown. The poor woman found herself caught in a bind, unable to tell him to stop or continue, all well knowing that firing him would be a recipe for disaster. Yes, pun intended. In the end, Mr. Cook emerges victorious, grinning like a mischievous culinary mastermind. The restaurant can open its doors, the rice is ready, and the day is saved. It's a triumph for all the underdogs in the kitchen who know that sometimes bending the rules can lead to the best outcomes. So here's to you, Mr. Cook, the rice rinsing extraordinaire. May your future endeavors be filled with clear water, perfectly cooked grains, and plenty of humor to spice up your culinary adventures. This story comes to us from Unreal Square. Want to make petty demands while I'm solving our mutual problem? Okie doke. Let's jump right in. Background: this happened a while ago when we lived on a city block of semi-detached houses with tiny front yards. At one point, the older guy who lived next door, there was an alley with sidewalks and grass separating our house from his, which had another house attached to it, passed away, and Flipper got hold of the house. They basically did a cosmetic pass and sold it for tons more money than they paid. New neighbors seemed nice, but immediately began having tons of problems with the house, and a couple years later had moved across the country and abandoned the property. I had their number and called to ask if they minded me cutting the grass in front because it was really long. They were super apologetic and explained they just couldn't afford to keep up with the repairs and the mortgage. The house was going to be foreclosed on, and even tried to pay me for cutting the grass, which I refused. It only took about 5 minutes extra, these are city yards we're talking about, and kept it from looking like there was a vacant house on the block. One day, I had just gotten done cutting the grass and went back inside when there was some knocking at the door. I look out and it's the neighbor 2 houses down with the vacant in between us attached to their house. They were sort of urgently, angrily demanding that I come look at something. Thinking there was something consequential going on, I came out and walked with them to the front of their house. Neighbor, looking at their yard in irritation, "Do you see what's going on here?" Me, looking around, having not a clue. So it turns out that each time I cut the grass, I was inadvertently blowing grass clippings onto the neighbor's landscape pavers, and they were really not pleased with this. I tried to explain how I was just trying to help keep the block looking nice by cutting the grass, and that as soon as a mild breeze came by, the grass clippings would vanish from the pavers. Well, they weren't too happy with that and demanded that I keep the clippings off their pavers or sweep them off whenever I cut the grass. At that point, I was pretty annoyed, but just said in my nicest neighbor voice, "No problem at all. I'll take care of it. You won't have any more issues." Went to get a push broom, swept their pavers off real nice, and then proceeded to comply with the request. I made darn sure 0 grass clippings got on their pavers by not ever cutting the grass in front of the abandoned house attached to their house, remember, again. It looked atrocious until it dawned on them that it was now their responsibility and ended up having to pay someone to keep cutting it until the house went through foreclosure. Well, it seems like this tale takes Law & Order to a whole new level. From flipping houses to clipping controversies, it's a cutthroat world out there. Our protagonist mows the line and inadvertently turned a tidy neighborhood into a turf war zone. But fear not, for in the end, the grumpy neighbors reaped what they sowed, having to pay the price for their paver predicament. It's a lawn mowing lesson in karma that reminds us to tread carefully in the green pastures of neighborly relations. So let's all raise our glasses and toast to the grassy adventures that keep our lawns and our lives far from being a bunch of weeds. Alright, our first story today comes to us from the Empress of the World. You want me to be responsible for everyone else's job? Okay, let's jump right in. First time poster, so apologies ahead of time, but I was remembering this story last night and thought it might be appropriate here. Years ago, I worked for an independent dog boarding facility as a customer service representative. Because I was low man on the totem pole, I often got the evening shift. The managers all left an hour or 2 early, leaving me and 2 to 3 other employees to close, depending on how many dogs we had. Sometimes as few as a couple dozen, but often well over 100 in the busy times. My primary responsibility was closing down the office work, closing the register, making sure all paperwork was in order, etc. Once that was done, I had to pick up with finishing bigger tasks, like taking out the trash and laundry, but the actual animal care was supposed to be the other employee's job. If they needed help with things like cleaning cages or dishes or non-animal handling things, I was happy to do so. They just needed to tell me. They knew what needed to be done, and if they didn't tell me, I did the other tasks and had no reason to think they hadn't finished their tasks. Also, keep in mind that the managers were always on our rears to finish up and clock out by 9:15. Barely doable with the staff they gave us when we had 30 dogs. When we had 100 plus dogs, we often were much later, something we were as unhappy about as the managers were. One very busy night, this one guy, we'll call him Michael, I don't even remember at this point, was in charge of the small dog room. Because it's indoors rather than a big building with runs, it could only hold about 15 dogs, and thus took a lot less time than the big main building. The person on the small dog room was expected to be finished that room and then go out and finish with the rest of the dogs. By the time I was done with my office work, Michael was up at the big building with our coworker, and I asked whether there was anything they needed help with or whether I could focus on the trash and laundry and making sure doors were locked. Michael said everything was done in the dog room and there were no problems. So I moved on with my job, and about 15 minutes later, it was already 9:45, We were done and left. The next morning, I get called into the small dog room, and my manager angrily gestures at the sink. There are 4 or 5 dog bowls sitting there that hadn't been cleaned and put away. She asked me why they weren't done. I pointed out that the small dog room was Michael's responsibility, and he had told me he'd done everything. She said it was the responsibility of everyone to make sure every task was done before we left, no matter who had been officially in charge of the task. I didn't point out that I highly doubted she'd hold the other employees accountable if I messed up doing my tasks. I apologized, but figured in my head that I was getting a verbal warning because it was only 4 to 5 bowls that had been forgotten and was easily fixed and would be something I would make note of for the future. Instead, all of us got an official mark on our records. Cue malicious compliance. From there on out, I took my sweet time checking and double checking that every job was done and done so that there would never be the smallest question that it hadn't been done well enough, no matter how small. I also made sure that my coworkers went behind me and did the same thing. A small piece of debris missed while sweeping the floor, got to do it again. Better wash those bowls again. The bed in this empty cage looks slightly askew. Better fix that. I'd check to make sure every door was closed and locked, and then do it again 2 or more times. Now, because the managers couldn't be bothered to make the people responsible for doing their job actually responsible for their own job, we all had to spend the time checking behind everyone else, which meant that we added another 15 to 20 minutes of time on top of actually doing the job. Make me responsible for doing someone else's job instead of expecting them to actually do their job? It's going to cost you an hour of overtime combined. This tale had me howling. You took your duties doggedly and then unleashed some pup-tastic malicious compliance. It's a rough situation when management unfairly barks up your tree, but you didn't roll over. You meticulously covered every territory and locked every door, making them pay for their mistakes. Here's a high paw for not letting them lead you astray and teaching us all a possum lesson. This next story comes to us from Captain David. Woman wasn't expecting she would be having a riding buddy. Let's jump right in. This malicious compliance takes place in the Czech Republic, where many people are often really grumpy. My girlfriend, 30, and I, male 21, were waiting for a bus ride to go to her hometown for a wedding. As you'd expect, we had 3 bags, and they were packed to the point where zipping the bag required you to sit on it, especially her bag, as she was one of the bridesmaids. Before we boarded the bus, we had to wait for the passengers who had paid beforehand to reserve seats. My girlfriend and I had not prepaid. We were in somewhat of a line which allowed for the passengers who reserved seats to pass. The line for unreserved seat passengers was essentially respected, except by this woman. She arrived when the line was somewhat being formed and decided to stand next to us. As our turn to board was coming up, she quickly scooted in front of my girlfriend and looked forward as if she was completely oblivious to the fact she had done something that was traditionally frowned upon. My girlfriend was obviously quite annoyed and started saying out loud, in English, much of the older generation in this country doesn't understand English very well. Well, that's a bitchy thing to do. Can you believe this woman? I was calm, as I had counted how many people had already boarded the bus, and there was still a good chance we'd find seats together in the unreserved rows, so I didn't think it called for any type of confrontation. Still, I had calmly responded, let's be honest, we can't be surprised when bitches do bitchy things. Looking back, it was unnecessary, but I was also tired and the bags were heavy, so I was a bit impatient. We finally sit down and my girlfriend chose to sit in the 2 free seats behind her. I would have chosen the seats in front of her and then just slowly recline my seat back every few minutes so that she wouldn't have noticed my little act of revenge, but this ended up being better. It's important to note that the row the woman chose was the last row with an overhead shelf for bags. The shelf was a little longer in the front, so every person essentially had space for their bag if they moved their bags a little towards the front of the bus. It's also important to mention that the shelf was essentially empty, and I could have placed another 5 bags next to ours if I wanted to. We finally hit the road, and the woman is talking on the phone, loudly I might add, saying how she's going to visit her grandson, who is so sweet, but that he plays metal music in his room, and she can't stand the sound of it. After she finishes the call, she takes off her windbreaker and plans to put it above her seat. She finally sees that my bag is directly above her seat, and instead of moving her jacket 35 centimeters to the right on the shelf, or setting her jacket on the empty seat beside her, she decides to confront me in an entitled tone. "Excuse me, young man, but I can't put my jacket anywhere because your fat bag is in the way." I was bored, so I decided to act like this was a tragedy. Oh no, what will we do? Maybe if we put our heads together, we can find a solution. Her face turned from shock to old communist grandma rage. She yelled back, "Well, don't you know that the shelf space is for the person directly below the seat?" Oh, I'm so sorry. I truly didn't know that was like an unspoken rule. So the space above your seat is only for you and the potential passenger next to you? I say, truly acting sorry and embarrassed. Yes, it is. So please move it to your spot, she says, acting victorious. Of course, right away. I quickly get up and take my girlfriend's bag off the shelf and place it on the seat where I was sitting next to her. I kept my bag in the exact same spot and plopped myself right next to the old woman with a grin. The look on her face was absolutely priceless, as she was trying to understand what just happened. I smile at her, take my headphones out, and play some death metal way too loud so that she can definitely hear it. I might have hearing loss. I don't even like death metal, but it was definitely worth it knowing she was annoyed the whole time. My girlfriend was sad I didn't sit next to her for the bus ride, but she ultimately agreed it was the best way to get back at her. Well, I must check myself before I get too carried away with this bag load of puns, but that story certainly begged my attention. This feisty lady sure seemed to carry on with her entitlement, providing a case study in bad manners. OP handled this beautifully though, making sure she zipped her lip and providing some heavy metal to her supposed piece. This next story comes to us from FGBP. I'm waiting for the customer, boss. Let's jump right in. I wanted to post this in r/petty revenge, but I think the malicious compliance part is more suitable here. My dad does food delivery service in his leisure time. He said he likes the community among the riders. All riders, motorcycle is really preferred for the traffic around the town, are provided with a helmet and a jacket that match the company logo color, plus some details on them. Delivery to hotels are common, as our town is one of favorite tourist destinations in the country, and traffic could be really a thing, especially during the holidays, while people craving for local cuisine but don't really want to deal with it. On to the malicious compliance story. One day, Dad got an order to deliver to Marriott Hotel. He was told by the security to leave the jacket behind before entering the lobby and while waiting for the desk to come for their food there. He argued about leaving the jacket behind, worrying as the motorcycle parking area is quite in the open. So the security told him to leave it in the concierge. This annoyed him, but he complied anyway. He gathered from other riders that the same security guy has been asking the same, and sometimes with a condescending tone. Dad came up with a little evil plan. This security guy mostly works in the day shift, so when he got another order to Marriott during the day, Dad took off his shirt and left it in the bike's container under the seat and wore nothing under the jacket. He walked towards the lobby, glancing the security who stood there with a smug face, and headed towards the concierge, took off his jacket, and sat pretty on the couch in the lobby while the receptionist looked at him with horror. "What are you even doing?" "I'm waiting for the customer, boss." "Bare-chested? Where's your shirt?" "It's a hot day, boss. I ride around the town with only my jacket on. No delivery jacket allowed in lobby, no? Your colleague, that security guy, told me so." Just leave the food with me, and please put your jacket back on. Thank you." The security guy realized the situation a bit late and could only watch the whole exchange with his jaw dropped. Next time my dad gets an order to Marriott, the same guy just told him to leave it with him. This cheeky tale of your dad's delivery exploits really hit the spot, Your dad, refusing to be taken for a ride, seasoned that security guard with a hot plate of petty revenge. His bare-chested response to the no jacket rule cooked up quite a stir, serving up discomfort a la carte. He truly proved that the best way to resolve a uniform beef is to strip to the bone. The security guard surely bit off more than he could chew and won't be dressing down the riders again soon. After all, who knew that delivering justice could be such a dish? And that right there is some fast food for thought. This last story comes to us from Oreo Lover 63. Sit in a broken chair? If you say so. Let's jump right in. Several years ago, I worked in a group home helping people with mental illnesses. During the day, we had 2 to 3 staff working at a time. We would work with the clients, and then at the end of our shift, we would log what we did. There was one office with 3 computers in it. One day, I came in, and the chair for one of those 3 desks was broke. It was obviously unsafe to sit in. I asked my coworkers if anyone had reported this to our manager. My coworkers told me that our manager stated the chair was not broken, even though it was cracked and leaning to one side. I thought this was so ridiculous, I took a picture of the chair and sent it to my friends, and we all got a good laugh about the definitely not broken chair. The next day I came into work and everything was fine, until it was time to log everything in the computer. There were 3 of us, and now with only 2 usable desks, we had to take turns doing notes, while the other just stay there. Our manager came in and asked why one of us was just sitting there. We pointed out that the chair was unsafe, and we could not use the desk without it. Side note, just before I was hired to work here, I had a serious medical problem, in which for 9 months, I was unable to eat solid food, and had lost so much weight I was only 80 pounds. My recommended weight is 140 pounds for my body type. I was getting better, and my manager and coworkers were completely unaware that this was the reason for my weight. My boss insisted that the chair could be used. He then told my 2 other coworkers that they were too fat, and that's why the chair broke. He stated that he wasn't going to buy any new office furniture until everyone in the office had lost weight, because we were costing the company money by damaging the furniture. He explained that I was a healthy weight. I most certainly was not, and everyone should be more like me. To prove that this chair was safe and obesity was the problem, my boss asked me to demonstrate to my coworkers how an ideal employee can use this chair. My boss was expecting to sit in the chair carefully and cautiously, since it was really broken. But I wouldn't be here if that's what happened. I plopped down in the chair. It broke in half instantly and I fell to the ground. I then pointed out to my boss that company policy requests that he fill out an incident report due to my fall. The next day, my boss calls me into his office and shows me the incident report he filed, in which he told corporate that I had intentionally broken a usable chair. He explained that corporate was angry and had demanded that he take the cost of a new chair out of my paycheck. I mentioned that he forgot to add a few details to his report, which I would be happy to fill corporate in on. The first being the chair was indeed broken, and I had a picture from the day before the incident to prove it was already broken. My boss said I was lying. I showed him the photo and he went white. I further explained that he forgot to tell them he ordered me to sit in the chair despite several people mentioning it looked unsafe, and I had 2 witnesses to that statement. I got up and stated that I would let corporate know now before I forget. My boss panicked and stated that he would not take the cost out of my paycheck, and he would order new chairs, which we desperately needed for all the desks. Don't call my friends fat and try to push unhealthy body images. Well, it seems like this story took quite the cheerful turn. Working in a group home should be about providing support, not making weighty accusations. The boss really took a seat on the wrong side, claiming the chair was fine and blaming their employee's size for the damage. Thankfully, OP didn't let this weighty issue slide and decided to put the boss's claims to the test. The result? Chairmageddon. But with evidence in hand, they made it clear that the boss's report was as shaky as a wobbly chair leg. It's important to remember that we should lift each other up, not bring each other down. Kudos to OP for standing up for their friends and reminding us all that healthy body images are worth fighting for. This story comes to us from Anonymous. Boss punished me by reducing my hours, but didn't tell the other boss. Let's jump right in. This happened quite a while ago. I was working remotely for a staffing agency, organizing and managing events. When I was initially hired on, it was due to the fact that 3 employees were quitting. They all seemed to be leaving amicably to pursue other ventures, so I didn't think anything of it. They had hired myself and one other person to replace them, and everything was going fine. Over time, I started to notice little things here and there, like issues due to miscommunication between the owners, married couple, and a heavy workload. A few months in, I was assaulted and had been injured pretty badly. It was really difficult, obviously, but I worked remotely, so I was still able to work. I told my bosses I had an emergency and I was injured and needed to take time off. Almost immediately, one of the owners called and left an angry-sounding voicemail. I called him back and ended up having to tell him I had been assaulted and went to the hospital and all that. He seemed sympathetic, but near the end of the conversation, he noted that I was supposed to be managing an event that weekend, Friday to Sunday, and that they had no one else to manage it. He didn't do any of that, but his wife did. However, we always had at least 5 events we were organizing and managing at a time. I was afraid I would get fired, so I ended up having to work that weekend. It wasn't so bad, but I was in an incredible amount of pain. And due to my injuries, the doctor said that they couldn't prescribe me strong pain medication due to complications that may arise. I worked that weekend and pushed through. Shortly after that, they fired another employee and gave me her workload. Then, they chose me to do a very long-running, 2+ month event taking place in 2 different time zones. They initially decided the event would be split between myself and another employee. She was pregnant, it matters for context, due to the size of the program. So while I was dealing with the assault and healing, took me 1 month for my injuries to heal, I was also doing the majority of the workload of this event. I was also having to plan a move, put my stuff in a storage unit, and living in long-term sublet while I looked for a place. I was also organizing other events on top of that, so there were days where I would easily work 10+ hours. Eventually, the employee who was helping me went on maternity leave, so the whole program landed on my shoulders. One day, I got reprimanded for working overtime. I explained that the workload was heavy, and since I was managing events in 2 time zones, I was having to wake up super early in the morning, 4 a.m., work during the day, take a long lunch, work some more, then wrap up the other event, which ended in the evening, 10:30 to 11 p.m. They basically told me I needed to manage my time better. Well, I was not doing well mentally or physically, so my cognitive abilities weren't the best. I was making small, easily fixable mistakes here and there, but nothing that was damaging or severely detrimental to the business. There were days I would just sit there crying at my desk. It was awful. Another employee had also been reprimanded for working overtime, and she was as swamped as I was. Eventually, one of my bosses emailed me and said I was still working too much overtime, and that he wanted me to only work 5 hours on days where I wasn't managing the big event. I was relieved, honestly. I was looking forward to having more time for myself so I could heal. I made sure to email him back to confirm the non-show management days he wanted me to work 5 hours for the following week. Well, he didn't tell his wife, the other owner, about my new hours, and she had a tendency to ramble about stuff during meetings, making them last way longer than they needed to be. One day, we had a meeting in the morning that lasted 3 hours, and it was the first day I was to only work 5 hours. I didn't even need to be in that meeting, but they forced me to stay and would get irritated if they knew myself or other employees were quietly working while listening to the meeting. After that meeting, the wife sends me messages on asking the progress of some things I was working on. She then added more things for me to do. The back and forth with her took about 20 minutes. I told her that I knew I wouldn't have enough time to finish those things that day because I only had a little over an hour and a half to complete the other tasks I had already been assigned. She had no idea what I was talking about, So I told her that her husband had reduced my hours on non-management days, and forwarded her our email exchanges where he confirmed I was only to work 5 hours that day. She got an attitude with me and said, "Well, these are high priority things and we need you to work on them. You can go ahead and work longer today." I told her I couldn't because I had confirmed a week prior and had made arrangements and was not able to work. So once I hit my 5 hours, I clocked out and put my phone on Do Not Disturb, ignoring all the messages she was sending me. She ended up having to work on all the tasks she had given me, late into the night. I continued to follow the new schedule, and they just dumped my workload onto other employees or had to do it themselves. I eventually got fired because they said that was basically the last straw, but I was so relieved and also got unemployment benefits even though they tried to fight it. Jumping down to the comment section on this one, there's one from a user called YParticle. It says, "Oh man, I'm so sorry. There's no way that could have ended well with that sort of dysfunctional family business. But you did the very best you could with what you had to work with. Perfect malicious compliance." OP responded to this one and said, "Thank you, it was toxic all around. The wife had a difficult time communicating in writing, so she would often jump around between topics, which made it hard to follow what she was referring to. I would have to copy and paste her messages into a document and organize it, and then list the items in order. It was such a headache, and she was often wrong. Both of them were, about stuff, but never admitted it. One day, the husband accidentally deleted important documents one of my coworkers had been working on, and just laughed it off. My coworkers were sweet and we would help each other out as much as we could. If I found mistakes in their work, I would quickly fix it, in hopes that they wouldn't notice. We were all so stressed. They made both myself and another coworker cry during a meeting one time. The husband would practically yell at us and then lecture us over the tiniest mistakes. We had both cried because we were the ones working overtime and were just completely stressed by the workload. Yeah, OP, the owners here were obviously taking advantage of you. Another thing to think of here too though, is that they got rid of 3 people, but they only brought on 2. Now, those numbers seem kind of reversed to me because normally, if you fire one person and they're an expert at what they do, you need to bring on 2 people to cover that job. Or at least keep that person on long enough that they'll be able to train a replacement to cover things in the way that they do. But it doesn't sound like that happened in this situation. So that right there was a big red flag going in. 3 people fired, 2 people hired. Uh-oh. To wrap this one up, OP did mention in another comment that they found a better job after that, but it did take a while, and immediately after they were fired, they slept for like 4 days. This story comes to us from Leals87. Complain to me pretending to be a patient's father? Well, let's involve her parents then. Let's jump right in. I used to work at a very nice private hospital where the place looked like a hotel. The food was great and the service unrivaled. We were voted best private hospital in the country quite a few times, and all around people were happy and the care was great. The nurses were mostly old school, stern, but very passionate about patient care, with no time for anything that stops them from doing their job. My job was to focus on marketing and complaints, and to be honest, I didn't have a lot of work on the complaint side, but every now and again, something would come up. If there was an incident, the RNs would usually come and warn me to expect something, and give their side of the story. One morning, as I got to work, an RN was waiting at my door to update me on an incident the previous night. There was an 18-year-old patient who had a small operation, but was prone to dizziness and fainting. Now, slip and falls are a big thing in hospitals, and these incidents get monitored very closely. Since she was a slip and fall risk, they moved her to a private room right in front of the nurse's station so that she can be monitored throughout the day and night. One night, the tattoo-clad, older nurse's description, 20-something boyfriend comes to visit, and forgets that this is in fact a hospital and not a hotel. Old school, stern nurse realized something is amiss when the room's doors were closed and, after she pushed the door open, the curtains around the bed were drawn too. Seeing the privacy take second priority to a patient's healing and safety in a hospital, old school nurse wasn't having any of this. She pulls the curtain open, pulls the boyfriend out of the hospital bed and gave them both a talking to. Tattoo boyfriend left soon afterwards, apparently furious that his evening was ruined. Sure enough, 2 hours after the nurse visited my office, I get a mail from the patient's father, detailing how his daughter's privacy was invaded the previous night, how she had a private conversation with her boyfriend, and how they were unfairly treated by a nurse. I was surprised that an older gentleman would write an email to a hospital with so many spelling errors and complete lack of punctuation. But the email address, something like tattooguy@gmail, was a total giveaway as to who the real author was. Now, technically, I was just able to reply on the email, detailing our experience and side of the story. However, sharing private patient information on an email to an unconfirmed email address is bound to get me in serious trouble. So I did what any sane and perhaps slightly malicious person would do. I called document control and asked them to pull the email address on file for me. This happened to belong to her mom. I forwarded the email to her, mentioning that I received the following email from her daughter's father. But since she is the contact person on file, and we need to stick with the people that we have permission to contact, may she be as kind as to share our response with him. I then detailed what the nurse told me about the patient being a slip and fall risk that requires constant monitoring, about the boyfriend visiting, about the door and curtain being closed, and the nurse catching them in the hospital bed together. I apologized on behalf of the nurse for invading their privacy, but explained that open doors are protocol to ensure a patient's safety, and our main priority is getting a patient safe, healthy, and back at home as soon as possible. I ended the mail with my contact details and invited her to contact me if she has any further questions. Well, if the parents didn't know about the incident, they knew now. I am told the daughter was well behaved for the remainder of the time, and the boyfriend didn't stop by once during the rest of the patient's stay. So, lessons learned: don't include your parents' details on your hospital file as your main contact details if you don't want them contacted. Don't try and catfish a hospital employee, and respect a hospital for what it is, a place of healing and not a hotel. Okay, I really like this story. Would you not like to be a fly on the wall when the actual father of the patient gets a hold of Tattoo Guy? Could you imagine how that conversation would go? There's a reason why Tattoo Guy never came back to the hospital. It's because the fear of actual dad had gotten to him. Now, another way to look at this one though is if this patient was 18, why did they even bother responding to that email? Sure, it was a complaint, but they could tell it wasn't coming from an actual parent just by the email address on file. I'm not quite understanding why they wouldn't just go back to the patient and say, hey, you're an adult, let's deal with this. We both know this wasn't one of your parents contacting us, so here's your warning, you need to deal with this. This next story comes to us from Annika. You know how it's done? Right then, let's jump right in. So, about 15 or so years ago, I was working in a little metalworking firm. 2 brothers owned 30 or so workers, metal casting, further processing up to and including wires and other things. Bad explanation is bad. We had about 5 women working in production, me, my mom, and 3 others. One of them was the unofficial sweetheart of one of our bosses. Karen, changing the name for privacy, couldn't do wrong. Whatever went wrong wasn't her fault, ever. I had a run-in with her a few times already, and it wasn't the best. But I'm more of the silent type. Let others do what they want, I'll do my thing, etc. Us women were mostly there for preparing the product for sending out, washing metal bits, grinding back seams, sorting small things into good and broken and not fully cast, etc. I'd been working there summers in the 90s with my gran as unofficial supervisor, and she showed me the ropes. Later, when I worked there full time, I knew the ins and outs of everything, and some tricks gran worked out along the way. Especially with our washing machines. Imagine them as a big bowl, filled with specialty formed stones, add water and cleaning agent, the metal bits, and it would vibrate, and the stones rubbing against the product with soap and water would clean the product from residual oil and other things. One of the machines required a more special touch, apart from throw in, start done. I've been working there long enough and been shown by gran and mom how to set up that machine. It polished the metal on top of cleaning it with tiny spherical metal bits. Never cared enough to ask what they were made of. It was enough to know how to use it to make things shine. So one day I get a call, boss asking if I was washing something at the moment and what I was working on. I told him no, done with the washing. I was just now drilling the last holes and preparing the product for shipping out. He said he'd send Karen down with something time sensitive, and that was that. Karen comes down an hour later. Crate with time sensitive products has been there for a while, and it's coated with oil, soot, and all things nasty, ready to be cleaned and polished in that special machine. I ask if she needs help or some pointers since I know the machine is a bit complicated to set up right. She looks at me, dirty and sweaty as I was from actually working, and she was nearly pristine from doing whatever she did with the boss. I don't care, keep me out of it. And sniffs, tells me she knows how to wash them, and disappears in the washroom. Well then, if you know. A colleague comes over and asks if she ever used that machine, and I shrug and tell him, not that I know of. She wasn't very popular there, can you tell? I go back to work, time goes by, lunch, more time, and then our boss shows up. Product needs to be sent out today. Not long after, there's a shout for me to come to the washroom. Turns out, Karen doesn't know how to use the machine. The whole thing is oily, black, and nasty. Product looks worse than before. She used the wrong cleaning agent, didn't add the polishing powder at the right time, and pretty much effed up the whole thing. Boss asks me why I didn't say something, help her, intervene, anything. Well, she said she knew what to do. Ask colleague, he was there. Door to the washroom is closed, and I have other things to do than stick my nose where it's not wanted. Do I know how to deal with this problem? Sure. Machine and stones need cleaning. Product needs cleaning. It's gonna take a while. In the end, Karen was allowed to finish my dirty work, and I spend the rest of the day cleaning up her mess. I wasn't allowed to leave the washroom, boss's orders. So I started a washing cycle with the right agent and no product in to clean the machine and stones. Sat down and did nothing. Then added the product, more cleaning agent and powder after the oily gunk was gone, and pretty much spent half a day doing close to nothing while Karen had to do my work. I could have helped her, but us unwashed peasants were not good enough for Her Highness. Okay, something threw me off in this story. I'm a Canadian, and a washroom up here is where you go to take a piss. It took me a minute to clue in that that was a room where the machine for washing was. Yep, here I was sitting back going, why would she take the part into the bathroom to wash it in the sink? I don't get that. It was nice to see that OP finished off Karen and then cleaned up the mess and just called it a day. This story comes to us from Representative Fox 279. Don't want to give me a parking pass? Okay, fine. Let's jump right in. This takes place at my first real career job at a large contractor. Details are intentionally left vague and names are fake. I took a job doing design and CAD work at this company that designs, engineers, and builds large pieces of equipment. There are both union and non-union jobs at this company. My particular job fell into the unionized category. There are also 2 locations for this company close to each other, but separated by a 15 to 20 minute drive. The company operated a shuttle between the 2 locations because having to visit both sites was common. This is important later. My first day, I'm told to report to the west location at 7 a.m. Tell the guard it's my first day, and he'll contact my supervisor to come get me. The building is huge and confusing to new people, so this is regular practice. Over an hour later, the supervisor still doesn't come get me. Turns out he wasn't happy with getting a new person to fill his group's vacancy, so he decided to just ignore me. Context here, the products this company produces are large and complex. Onboarding, training, and getting up to speed in your role and product takes well over a year before most people actually output useful work. Management, unsure of what to do, assigns me to another random supervisor who has a vacancy in their group. This supervisor is based out of the east location. By the time this all gets worked out, I finally get to my new desk around noon. This is a good point for me to remind you that this job is union, hourly, and so far I've done nothing but sit in a lobby or drive between locations. Big foreshadowing hint here. Fast forward a few weeks, I'm now working in the East location doing required training, trying to learn the product, computer system, and process. But by far and away, I'm doing nothing. The group was slammed with work, so having to show a new person how to do everything step by step was too big of a drain. While I tried to observe as much as I could and ask questions, nothing really ever got assigned to me. I'd occasionally ask my boss for work, only to get assigned low-grade busy work, like making sure past work was filed correctly. It always was. Lots of chit-chat happened in the cubicles during this time, which is how I realized I had nothing in common with any of the 12 to 15 coworkers or my boss. Not that we didn't get along, but they were all the sports, drinking, and going out type people, whereas I'm happy staying in and gaming all weekend. By the end of the first few months, I'm obviously the black sheep of the group. Between this and me asking for work all the time, crazy thing to do at work, right? My boss happily volunteers me for a 6-week temporary assignment in the West location. I promise we'll get to the malicious compliance soon. More detail, the special project taking place was a cost analysis. They want a small group of 3 people to do a small part of a certain job so they can see the man hours and cost associated, to extrapolate out whether or not they want to do this job at scale. It's very obvious to me at this point that my boss just wants me gone, since volunteering a new guy who hasn't done any real work yet makes no sense. Fast forwarding a bit, this job turns out to be wonderful. My coworkers are great. The West location is in a much newer, nicer building, and I actually get work to do in a software program I'm very proficient with. Except for one huge, glaring issue. I'm an employee at the East location in corporate system. Since this is a temporary assignment, it means they can't assign me a desk or a parking pass for the West location because the system won't allow it. Amplifying info, this is a company-owned parking garage. You can't gain access without a pass, period. There is no paid parking or any other way to get in. This means I have to get in super early to get street parking, and I don't have a permanent desk. Every morning starts with a tour to find someone's desk who is out sick, on vacation, etc. We're talking people's personalized desks, knickknacks, family photos, personal effects. This was super awkward for both me and the person who owned the desk. It got old very quickly. Some days I'd be working on the opposite side of the floor, or even on a different floor from my group. Before y'all ask, why didn't you just sit at an empty desk? There were no empty desks. The company was in the middle of a hiring spree and brought in new employees before they knew where to put them. Cue malicious compliance. Remember I said I was union? I consult one of the union representatives about my situation to see if, since I'm working at the West location, they can do anything about getting me a desk or parking pass. Long story short, they can't because technically the company is providing a desk and parking. It doesn't specify whether or not it has to be in the building you work in. What is in the contract, however, is a stipulation that says employees must clock in and out on their designated work floor. This is in there because before it was specified, people would clock in at the nearest time clock inside the front door, and then take the elevator, stairs, or plain old get lost on the way to their desk while on the clock. On the way out, they'd do the same thing. Basically, lining up at the time clock nearest to the door, ready to clock out, and immediately be out the door. Now, if you've been paying attention thus far, you'll remember I'm on temporary assignment at the West location, from the East location in corporate system. I consult my boss in the West location about this, and I get a dismissive response of, "I don't want you violating any union rules or company policy." Okay, boss, you got it. To be clear, I was working temporarily under a different boss while West, but was technically in the system as working under East boss at East location. My normal West Side morning routine was to get in around 5:20 a.m. to get close street parking because I wasn't allowed a parking pass for the parking garage, browse my phone for a while, clock in for 6 a.m. on the dot, and work till 4 p.m. We had flexible schedules that allowed you to work 4 10-hour days, 4 days a week. Any guesses on how that changed? You got it. This loyal, non-rule breaking employee now showed up at the East location for 6 a.m., clocked in, and walked right back out the door to catch the employee shuttle between locations. Now, there was a 6 a.m. bus from East to West, but I couldn't possibly be both at the time clock for 6 a.m. and outside getting on the bus at 6 a.m., so I had to catch the 6:20. By the time I got to the West Building and found a desk, it was normally 6:45-ish. At the end of the day, I had to catch a shuttle going the other way too, since I was required to clock out on my designated floor on the east side, and that's where my car was parked. This meant catching a 3:20 bus to arrive around 3:45-ish just to twiddle my thumbs till 4 o'clock. The crazy part? Management didn't care. I explained why I was now starting work 45 minutes later than usual, just to get another dismissive, passive response from my boss. This cost analysis job was poorly planned and ended up taking way longer than anyone guessed. When we hit the 6-week mark, the original schedule for this job, there was still a ton of work to do. Instead of reassessing the situation and seeing if it was worth proceeding or not, like maybe analyzing the cost of what was going on, management decided to approve overtime. Once again, I'll remind you, I'm union at this job. It's spelled out very clearly in the union handbook that anything after 40 hours a week is time and a half pay. Saturdays are also 1.5 times, and Sundays are 2 times. Instead of working 4 10-hour days per week, it became 5, with the 5th day being a full 10-hour day of 1.5 times pay, all while riding the bus both ways on the clock. This lasted till around the 3-month point before management got really desperate. My temp boss was fed up with upper management wanting to know why this supposedly 6-week job was now stretching past 12, and why it was hemorrhaging money. Once again, instead of taking a step back and asking if the cost analysis job was proving to not be worth the cost, they cut expenses by cutting me. Remember way back I said it was a small group of 3 people? This job was only me, a woman we'll call Kate, and a guy we'll call Stan. Stan was actually the most senior person by job title in the group, but didn't know his butt from his elbow. Kate, meanwhile, was stuck attending status meetings and doing the final audit on our work, looking for any errors that would screw up manufacturing. Stan's work was sloppy, usually wrong, and required constant help with the CAD program we used. Now, I'm all about giving everyone a chance, teaching them, and helping them grow in any way I can. I was very proficient with the software, and had learned the processes by now. Stan was different. Nice person, but was running a brain cell deficit worse than the US government's budget. This project was now relying solely on Stan to produce all the remaining work. I get sent back to my original supervisor on the east side, losing my crazy bus riding money and very generous overtime pay. I wouldn't say I was bitter, but I'm sure we've all been there when someone worse at their job makes more money. There I was, back at my old desk, under my old boss, right back to not doing anything. He didn't have any work for me at that time because while I was off in the other location, work for his group slowed down, and he truly didn't need me or expect me to ever come back. Fast forward 2 weeks of twiddling my thumbs, catching up on the gossip with my old cubicle mates, I get a phone call. It's my recent ex-boss from the west side, in a panic, asking if I can come fix what Stan did. Sure, no problem. Let me just hop on the shuttle and I'll be right over. Just have to check with my boss. Bonus points if you can guess if he cared or not. After 3 days of being right back to my bus riding overtime collecting schedule, the Westside boss asks for an honest, one-on-one meeting about what Stan did. I put it plainly that I honestly had no idea. Drawings that were reviewed, digitally sealed, and done were suddenly back open with Stan being the last person to edit them without justification. 3D models for parts he made were a mess. Anyone who does CAD work for a living knows how bad it can be. Drawings had dimensions that were manually overridden because he couldn't get the model the right shape and size. GD&T errors everywhere. His work part by part looked fine, but when you tried to assemble them digitally, nothing fit together. In addition, if anyone actually tried to use his work to machine a part, it would be a nightmare. I get asked how long it will take to fix it all. Weeks? A month? I'm at a loss at this point because I didn't even discover everything that was screwed up yet. The supervisor went quiet and said, "Thank you. Report back here to the West location tomorrow to continue work." Come tomorrow, Stan miraculously is transferred back to the group he was originally from. we were all temporarily assigned to this cost analysis job, and now it's just Kate and I on the project. Except now, to make up time, Saturdays and Sundays are approved for work. Cha-ching! To put the math in perspective, that's 40 hours Monday to Thursday, 10 hours of overtime on Friday, 10 hours overtime on Saturday, and 6 hours double time on Sunday. The max the company would allow us to work. Some quick maths, 40 hours at standard rate, plus 20 hours at 1.5 times, plus 6 hours at 2 times, that was a little over double my normal paycheck. I was young and single, so why not work 66 hours 7 days a week? The cherry on top was 5 days a week, they were still having to let me ride the shuttle on the clock because they still wouldn't give me a Westside desk or parking pass. Weekends were open parking in the garage, so I had that going for me, which is nice. Still hunting for an open desk every weekday though. After a lot of discussion and more digging through Stan's screw-ups, we decided to have IT roll back all saved files he touched since I was taken off the project. This meant essentially 2 weeks worth of Stan's work was undone with a few button clicks. To say our boss was pissed would be an understatement, but it was agreed on by all parties as the most cost-effective solution. Hooray! We finally considered cost during a cost analysis. This ended up stretching on for another 3 months, or about 6 months total, before it finally wrapped up. I never heard any results or updates from the project afterwards. I'm assuming upper management tried to bury it as quickly and deeply as possible. I ended up transferring departments in the West location after becoming friends with a different supervisor and him happily absorbing me into his group. For anyone who made it this far, yes, it finally meant I was in the system as a Westside employee. It was the most glorious day when I finally got my darn parking pass and my own darn desk assigned to me on the Westside. The cherry on top was, instead of going back to the previous boss who had no work for me, I got to keep working a full 5th day of overtime at 1.5 times pay on the Westside because my new group was very busy. Jumping down to the comment section on this one, there's one from a user called morejackfruit3010. It says, "These kinds of corporate waste stories have to be long, because the incompetent labyrinth of such places is just that, full of knots, and Peter Principle proved. I spent over a decade at a huge corporate campus doing planning and software, 3 big blue letters. This story sounds so familiar, yet heroic in the sense that OP found the twist that made it work in his favor. Well done." Pro tip for OP, when moving around to different departments, the project itself matters less than how well and long it's funded. I busted my butt myself on projects that were just cancelled due to funding loss, lost contracts, or shifting company priorities. Great gobs of my life gone for nothing but the monthly paycheck. Revised pro tip, run for your life, far and fast. Now let's take a look at another commenter who did the math. This one comes from Northern64 and says, "That's an average of 85 minutes a day shuttling across town. 5.7 hours a week for the first 6 weeks. 7.1 hours a week during the first round of overtime. 9.9 hours a week while you were working 7 days a week. Assuming you continued 7 days per week for the remainder of the 6-month project, that's a total of 189.9 hours spent traveling on company time. With overtime on day 5, Saturdays valued at 1.5 times, and Sundays at 2 times, that's a valuation of 228.1 billable hours. With a $35 an hour base rate, that'd be just shy of $8,000 you were paid to ride the shuttle. $7,982.92. In another comment, OP gave a little bit of insight as to why Stan wasn't fired for his incompetence. OP said he was not fired. Being union meant it was nearly impossible to fire anyone. If the company tried, there are steps to termination spelled out in the contract. The company would have had to prove he was being tasked beyond his skill set, reassign him, prove he was still unable to do a job that it was mutually agreed on was within his skill set, come up with a plan to get him training, etc, etc, etc. Basically, it wouldn't be worth the time to pursue. Unions can tie up anything forever. There's a couple of things that really get to me in this story. Number one, this isn't really about the shuttle. This is about incompetence. OP got hired for a manager who didn't request them or participate in the hiring. And then within 3 hours, they were reassigned to another manager who didn't want or need them. Yeah, this place doesn't know what each hand is doing. One hand is definitely not washing the other here. One hand is way out on the right side, one is way out on the left side, and they have absolutely no effing clue what either one of them's doing. You know, honestly, it sounds like most major corporations. Okay. This story comes to us from Sephiroth. You don't want to wait in the emergency department? If you insist. Don't know for sure if this fits here, but I thought you guys would appreciate what happened tonight. For starters, I work as a security guard for one of the few hospitals in our city. Besides dealing with combative patients and visitors and doing patrols around the campus, we occasionally get asked to assist with getting people out of their vehicles and escort them by wheelchair to the emergency department, or their appointment at an on-site clinic. Today, a couple of nurses came to our office asking for our help. They had received a call from a gentleman, who we will call Gerald, asking for help to get out of their car, as he was in severe pain. I went out with the nurses, pushing a wheelchair and radioing my partner to come assist, as it sounded like it was going to take some extra hands to help him out. It took a little bit for us to find him, but we found him thanks to him blowing his car horn for all to hear. Now, I have interacted with dramatic people before, and this guy was no different. He told us about how he was in so much pain, how he drove himself all the way over here and couldn't move the car anymore, and how he needed to be treated. We tried to offer help, but he refused to grab our arms or hands to steady himself, relying on the car door and the wheelchair to get himself in it. Once he got himself settled, he asked me to move the vehicle to a better parking spot. After all, he had handicap stickers, and he needed the space to get in when he finished his visit. So I obliged, feeling a little bit odd about the whole situation, and moved his car to a handicap spot near the emergency department entrance. Gerald got checked in at the emergency department, and we were done with the situation. At least, that's what I thought. Boy, were we wrong. Not even 20 minutes later, I get told that this guy wanted to leave and wanted us to take him back to his car. Apparently, he started complaining and moaning about how the wait time was too long. Keep in mind that there were people in the waiting room who had been there for hours. The emergency department was very full today, and this guy couldn't stand being there for even a few minutes. I first checked with emergency department staff because I was worried about the fact that he himself said he couldn't drive. They told me that since they hadn't triaged him and he wanted to leave so soon, they legally couldn't hold him here even if they wanted to, which they didn't care that much since they were already busy with treating their patients. So I went back out to the emergency department and asked him point blank if he was really sure he wanted to leave, because I didn't want to be held responsible in case he drove and got into an accident. But he said yes, he wanted to leave right then and right now. So I reluctantly pushed out of the emergency department toward his car. This is where my malicious compliance begins. Gerald starts saying, verbatim, "When we get to my car, I'm gonna call the ambulance." Wait, what? Yeah, gonna call an ambulance. I can't drive and I don't like everyone here except you. They're too slow here, and I'm not spending all night here. Besides, calling an ambulance will get me to a room quicker, and I can get help with my pain. So you want to call an ambulance to take you to the emergency department when you're already here at an emergency department, and all that because the wait time is too long for you? Yeah. You realize that if you call an ambulance, they may just take you back to the waiting area and have you wait there, right? Yeah, I know that. I'm still gonna call. Well, okay, if that's what you want to do. So after helping the guy into his car, I decided to let him do just that. At that point, there was nothing else I could really do. After all, I'm just a security guard, not his doctor. So I just pushed the wheelchair back inside and went about my business. About 30 minutes later, I'm looking at CCTV footage, and right there, next to this guy's car, is an ambulance. My jaw dropped. The guy actually called 911 for an ambulance, and they came. I continued to watch as the AMT workers helped this guy into a gurney and place him into the ambulance. Then, to my utter shock, they drove off campus. I had thought they were going to drop him back off here, but they freaking left for another hospital? I then realized a couple of things. One, this guy's going to another hospital and going to be gone for who knows how long. Two, when he gets discharged, he's not going to have a ride because, you guessed it, his car is over here at this hospital. Plus, our policy is that if a car is parked in our lot for a few days and we've confirmed that the owner is not here, we have to call the police and report an abandoned vehicle. So this guy is now getting additional costs added to his medical expenses because he took the ambulance, possibly have to wait even more in the emergency department of another hospital before being seen, and may rack up some fines for abandoning his car depending on how long he's there. All because he didn't want to wait in the emergency department with everyone else. But hey, guess 20 minutes was way too much for him. Sadly, OP added an edit onto the story that says, "Edit, just found out that the car was taken early this morning, so no car fines for this guy." Jumping down to the comment section on this one, we have one from a user called DV7K1. It says, "Not only that, but the ambulance trick does not work at all. Patients are triaged based on clinical reasoning. Watching similar people to this guy pull the same trick, come in by ambulance, get checked over, seen to, and triaged by the same nurse, and then get sent back out into the waiting room, the look on their face makes me warm and fuzzy every single time." This is an interesting comment because my experience with the hospital in town and some of the health issues I've had over the years is that if you get taken in an ambulance, they will generally take you to a room right away. Or they'll leave you in the hallway on the gurney, but inside the actual emergency room doors, not near the waiting room. And then as soon as they have a spot, they'll wheel you in. I've never actually been put back into the waiting room, nor have I seen somebody get put back into the waiting room. But then again, I'm talking about the Canadian healthcare system here, which is a little bit different than, down below us. So yeah, we won't talk about them. This story comes to us from Augustus B. McPhee. "Need me to stay back and cover a shift? This will cost you big time." This comes from about 15 years ago when I was, and still am, working with people with disabilities in a community home. It's a great job for those who like it, a terrible one for those who don't, meaning that any staff you meet are either very new or long-term like myself. As a consequence, the turnover rate of staff is high, and replacement staff are slow to be hired, meaning you often find shifts not covered straight away. This is an industry where simply not having a shift filled isn't an option, particularly where I work, in a house with a single day staff and a single night staff, each working 12 shifts on a 7-day spread over 2 weeks roster. There are some strict rules regarding hours you can work, intended to avoid burnout, but more used to keep a rein over time, which in our industry paid 70% of your hourly rate for the first 3 hours, above your 76-hour fortnightly maximum, and 100% for any time after that. You can't demand overtime, but if they require you to work longer, they can't not pay you overtime. Also worth noting is that the people we work with are vulnerable, meaning they cannot be left unsupervised. Long story short, you can't go home until your replacement arrives. So back in the early 2000s, we were having problems locating staff, lots of people working overtime, and a lot of fresh faces appearing and disappearing. The house I worked in wasn't difficult in particular for adults with intellectual disability, but there was no support, by which I mean the worker there had to fend for themselves. There was no supervisor in the next building, they were miles and miles away. I frequently at this time had to stay back half an hour, waiting for staff to come replace me. I was less than happy with the way it was handled each time I called the office to tell them the night staff haven't arrived. Do you know who is booked? To which I'd get the reply, "We're still looking, how late can you stay?" The obvious answer was, "Until I'm replaced." But what I often said was, "I prefer not to stay after the end of my shift, but that doesn't seem to matter now, so I'll stay here until someone comes." Each time a new face arrived, I'd give them all the information they'd need for the shift, introduce them, walk them through their duties, etc. This would take 20 to 30 minutes. The point being is, I don't just jump ship when a staff arrives to replace me. This is someone's home, and I like them, so I'm not going to leave them in the hands of someone uninformed. Cut to that weekend. My roster had me working 12-hour days, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. Come Friday night, my replacement didn't arrive. I waited. I sent a text message to the supervisor after 15 minutes, then called after 30, left a message, and when they eventually called back, I could tell they had not found a replacement. I told them I'd stay until they did. This was, by that time, an hour after I was meant to finish, 10 p.m. Come 11, they call and say they simply can't find a replacement. They offer a deal and say if I stay and do the night shift, I can take the next shift off. It's pretty even, so you won't miss out, they said. They then changed their tone and said, "It's not really a request. We have no other option. Treat this as a direction." I reminded them it was a passive house, meaning you got half the hourly rate from midnight, but you could sleep in the bed provided, so I'd actually be taking a pay cut. They didn't know what else they could do, so I made a suggestion. I'd stay and do the night shift, but I wasn't going to give up my next shift. I was going to do that one as well. They agreed. It meant they didn't need to find a replacement for me in the morning, so they thought it was a good deal for them. It was, however, an even better deal for me. It took a few emails over the weekend with the union to sort out the particulars, but what happened was this. Once I couldn't leave my worksite because of a lack of replacement, I was on overtime. As this overtime was because of a direction, not voluntary, it remained in place until I went home. Because I didn't agree to drop my following day shift, my overtime continued until I ended on Saturday night. The upshot being that working 36 hours in a row resulted in the equivalent of 60 hours pay. I was the first person to, as they say, pull this stunt, and word got around that if you didn't get replaced, you were actually the person who was in a position of power. It didn't take long until the department put a little more effort into training and employing extra staff, so something like this never happened again. Not at least to me. Jumping down to the comment section on this one, there's one from a user called Knows Idle. Appreciate your efforts in sticking it out to help people, but it's a shame those same efforts are taken advantage of, or even preyed on in such industries. Is there better shift changeovers now? OP responded to this comment and said, things had improved up to pre-COVID, but staffing numbers dropped again, so waiting for replacements when regular staff are on holiday is becoming common again. OP definitely won in this case, 60 hours worth of pay, wow. Now, management obviously wasn't doing the math there, and they really just needed somebody to cover, so I think they might have been a little flustered that they couldn't find somebody else, and didn't really think of the consequences of having OP stay there for so many hours. I mean, if this situation happened too many times, that would be a lot of money. And you know, that money could probably be better spent, I don't know, on new employees that could help take up the slack. This story comes to us from Grim, that guy. I'll meet the call count, but won't make the calls count. I worked at a call center for a collection agency for nearly 5 years. Anybody that has worked in this type of environment knows that there are all sorts of targets that are expected to be met, be they daily, monthly, or whatever. One of our targets was to make a certain number of calls per day. I believe it was 120. Naturally though, the more contact you would make with debtors, the less time there was to make other calls. It's usually not an issue, but some days you might make significantly more contact than others, and sometimes your call count might be 2/3 of what it should be. We would get regular updates on the call count, and our manager would let us know if we were on track, and at the end of the day, they would give you the final results. I found it very annoying when you would have a successful day collecting debts and generating revenue for the company, only to have a manager dwell on your call count. Any protest of, yes, I didn't meet the call count requirements, but hey, look at the revenue I generated today. It doesn't matter. The target must be met. Even if it wasn't a successful day, but I knew I still ended up spending much time in contact with these debtors in attempt to collect, I would ask managers to review my talk time to see that the efforts were being made to do what we are hired to do. It doesn't matter. The requirement must be met. Now, to be clear, a call only counted if someone picked up or the call went to a voicemail box that wasn't full. The system was unable to register events otherwise. Not in service, voicemail box full, rings out with no voicemail box or answer. Meaning, if you were to make hundreds of attempts in one day, only a fraction are registered. Everyone is aware of this, but it didn't matter to the company. Well, I was tired of the unfairness of it all. It also doesn't help that the company was grossly skimming our bonuses that my department's client provided to us as a reward for successfully collecting on these debts. It was really obvious when our bonuses became random numbers when it was only possible for them to be multiples of 5. Frustrated with this literal theft and underappreciation of successful collection, the whole point of the job, I decided to comply with the call count expectations and never be under the target again. I created a notepad file with a list of all the telephone numbers that went straight to voicemail. These are often numbers that have blocked us, or presumably the owner of the number set it up as away or something. From then on, I made sure to make 15 to 20 calls per hour that would register, implying that even more calls were being made that they just couldn't see due to the way the system registered calls. I would spread these calls out so my activity wouldn't seem suspicious and would spend all day reading articles on the internet. Naturally, the revenue I had been generating decreased by about 80%. How come you're not collecting? Well, manager, you can see I am surpassing my call count target and my talk time is very low, so I'm just not getting the opportunities to do so. It should be noted that whatever I was collecting after doing so was really easy. The people whose accounts we received who could pay and wanted to pay anyway. Often these people would call us, so I just relied on that to make it appear like I was doing anything at all. They started giving me lower value portfolios to work with, which is fine by me. You are stealing my bonus, the very incentive I have to do more than the bare minimum anyway for a paycheck. I honestly thought I was quiet quitting, but no, I had a reputation as a valued member of our department and company, so no one wanted to fire me. I guess they just chalked up my lack of success to the crap portfolios they were assigning me. Steal my bonuses and dwell on a target that would be better judged as a marker of effort rather than an end-all be-all, and I couldn't care less. I was getting paid to read. This went on for nearly 2 years until I had to leave for mental health reasons. OP added in a comment down below, it said, I should also add that I had created macros for the AS400, old IBM software, so that I could complete most system tasks with a simple keyboard shortcut, further reducing my bare minimum workload and increasing the time available to read. OP, that's actually awesome that you were able to reduce the workload. These days with AI, I think workloads are going to get reduced quite a bit more. Although I am kind of concerned about where AI is going, but that's for another video altogether. I think a lot of customer service jobs are going to get replaced by AI, and that's a really scary proposition. I really enjoyed your story though, OP, because I spent 8 years in call centers myself. I think I actually worked in like 9 different call centers over 8 years, but that's a whole other story as well. And I know how it goes in there and how tedious it can be. So your story was great to read about you screwing over the company that was trying to screw over you. This story comes to us from Rest Easy Girl. No, you said you wouldn't get it. First post on this sub, and it's a short one but a good one that my family always come back to laugh about. For context, this was a few years ago and involves my sister and parents. My sister is around 13-14 at this point, and her teenage rebellion is in full swing. At one point, my sister brings up wanting a pet of her own. We had dogs already, but she wanted something that was hers, and only hers. My parents were hesitant on the matter, given that my sister wasn't the most responsible teen, and any small animal like a hamster would be in danger if not kept a close watch on with my rescue dogs. Lucky for them, my sister didn't want a hamster or a rabbit or even a snake. My sister wanted a giant African land snail. If you're not familiar with the breed, they are huge snails, and not really everybody's idea of a cuddly pet. When my sister brought the idea of her new snail friend up to my parents, my dad immediately shot her down, stating, "We will not get you a snail. I'm never buying a snail for you." Pretty clear, snail problem done. My sister should move on to another idea soon, right? Wrong. Cue malicious compliance. See, my sister was, and is still, a stubborn person. So my dad said he won't get her a snail, but didn't explicitly say no snails allowed. A plan was formed. The weekend after the snail conversation, my sister asks to borrow some money to go shopping with her friends, and uses said money to purchase her very own baby snail. When she got home and introduced the snail, called Loki, my parents were livid. "We told you you couldn't get a snail." My sister, smug as ever, replied, "No, you told me you weren't buying one, so I did." Loki lived with us until my sister moved out at 19 and is still well today. This was lighthearted and my parents got over it very quickly, provided that my sister agreed to care for him, which she did. Plus, there's a lot less risk of a snail escaping into the clutches of my dog's paws than a hamster. Jumping down to the comment section, we have one from a user called Stumble Wiggins. It says, "Did she pay your parents back? 'Cause otherwise they did buy her a snail." Opie responded to that one and said, "Ha, good point. I don't think she ever did. We'll definitely be stealing your comment to bring to family dinner next time." So after doing a little bit of research into that kind of snail, they could live to be up to around 9 years old. That is crazy. That's a long time to look after a little thing that doesn't do much. Kind of an odd choice for a pet if you ask me. Might just be better off getting a rock. Put some googly eyes on it, drop it into a terrarium, good to go, and best part, it'll never die.